not convincing, but this is what we happen to do, and I think we appreciate it. You know, there was a time, not too many years ago, when I would give a speech on the House floor. Nobody was there, and I thought nobody was listening. But all of a sudden, you know, when you get a little bit away from inside the Beltway, we find out that there are a lot of Americans listening and who care. I'm asked by the media, am I surprised about the receptions I've been getting? And I have to admit the truth. Yeah, somewhat. I'm surprised and very pleased because, you know, at the beginning I was very reluctant to get involved because I thought we would need another generation to stir up a little bit of excitement, because I've been trying to stir up this excitement for a good many years, but in a very quiet way, voting in Congress, trying to set a record and set a standard, figuring that maybe someday somebody would care and they would look at it, but I thought it would be in the distant future. But I was persuaded to enter the race, and I did it with the idea that I did not know what would happen and how many people there would be. But let me tell you, I ran into a lot of people, a lot of optimism and a lot of enthusiasm. There's still a lot of belief in this country that we ought to restore the Constitution. They would like to paint the views that we hold as something extreme and radical and strange and marginal. But you know, it seems to me like what we stand for shouldn't be that strange. You know, what's so strange about obeying the Constitution? Why should that be strange? And you know, balanced budgets and free markets and property rights and the Second Amendment and the First Amendment emphasize all the amendments, and a foreign policy that makes sense, and then they say, well, this seems so extreme and so weird. And then they say, well, what about this silly policy about money that you have, that you're not supposed to have the Federal Reserve System? I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. Why couldn't we have it? To me, in analyzing it, is where did we ever come across this idea that paper money made sense? Oh, you need some money? Turn it over to the politicians that we fully trust, and then let them spend it with paper money. And if they don't have enough money, they get to print the money. You know, if you or I do that, you know what happens. Maybe go to jail. For some reason, I think maybe we ought to apply some of those rules to the counterfeiters up in Washington. Country knew a little bit about monetary policy because they had gone through destroying and experiencing the destruction of the continental dollar, and that's where that slogan came from, not worth a continental. Someday it might be, if we're not careful, it's not worth $1. Of course, it's not much worth $1 anymore anyway. So, but they were explicit in the Constitution that the Congress would have charge of the money system. They could only coin gold and silver. And there was no authority whatsoever for the central bank. Anyway, they tried it immediately. Hamilton immediately defied Jefferson and started a central bank, and Jefferson got rid of it. And then there was a second national bank, and Jackson got rid of it. You know, I'm sort of looking forward to the next president getting rid of it. Yeah! It's more complex than it was originally, but they claim that people can't understand it. And let me tell you, I know a few people in Washington that don't understand it very well. But it isn't that complex. The politicians like to spend money because if they spend money and give out programs, they get reelected. And they do raise a certain amount of taxes, way too much, but then they still never have enough. And then they borrow a lot. They even go to places like China, and they borrow money from China and Japan and Saudi Arabia, and then there's still not enough, so they resort to printing the money. But when they come up short and they print the money, this is a form of taxation, and it's an evil tax. It's the worst kind of tax, if there can be anything worse than the income tax, but nevertheless, it's a bad situation because it really taxes the poor and the middle class. People who constantly destroy their currency wipe out the middle class. We know the middle class was wiped out in Germany in the runaway inflation of the 20s. And so many times in Central America and South America they've had runaway inflation, and the middle class loses out. But systematically, when a currency is undermined, the wealth is taken from the middle class and transferred to the wealthy class. There is a transfer of wealth because of the way the system is designed. Whoever gets the money first gets it when it's valuable. When it circulates, the value goes down. And you see it in high prices. So where do you suffer today? You suffer from high prices of gasoline, educational costs, food, repair bills, and then our government comes along and says, oh, there's no inflation, it's only 2%. So the Social Security recipients get a 2% increase, and then they wonder why they're not keeping up. But this is a very bad situation. But one thing that's happened, even during this campaign last year, is that monetary policy and economic policy has become a very, very important issue because although the economy was quite weak before this campaign started, it has gotten much weaker. And I'm afraid it's going to get a lot weaker because I see no solutions currently in Washington. All they think about is spending more money and printing more money. And believe me, that is not the answer.
That's right.
We need Washington to spend less money. We need more money in your pockets. We want you to get to spend the money and invest the money. We don't want the Federal Reserve manipulating interest rates, and we don't need the Congress telling us how to spend our money. But the ultimate correction there is very obvious. We don't need the 16th Amendment. We need to get rid of the IRS completely.
Yeah!
Washington, they're talking about appropriating money and passing out programs. That won't work, but an immediate tax cut is quite all right with me. The bigger, the better. But it ought to be matched with spending cuts. Yeah. Because if you have the tax cuts and you don't cut the spending, that's more debt, more printing money, and the cycle continues on and on. So what we really need to do is see some cuts. The big problem is where can we get a consensus on cutting? Well, I think I found the place where it's most easy to cut spending and it will hurt the least amount of people. It is true, in a constitutional government and system, we would have a lot less government. We would probably get rid of 70 or 80% of what we have in Washington right now. But it would be much easier if we pick an easier target, and as far as I'm concerned, the easy target, the place where we ought to cut spending, is all the overseas expenditures. All great nations end because they spend too much money and they go broke and they destroy their currency and they have economic troubles, just as the Soviet system did just recently. And we're now maintaining an empire around the world, many, many countries, over 100 countries as well as 700 bases. And we're still expanding it, so we're still threatening more countries. Well, to maintain that whole empire is nearly $1 trillion a year. If we decide on a new foreign policy, very simply, it would mean that we would just come home. We would bring our... Korea, we would come home from Japan, come home from Europe, come home from the Middle East. Some people say, yes, but how will we protect our interests? Well, where are our interests? Our interests are right here.